Chloe Dixon drew her own wedding bodice tight across the dress form and marked the seam for letting out, as if she were altering a stranger's life, instead of the one that had already been traded for her. The muslin sat chalk pale in lamplight, the colour of surrender, and the narrow workroom at Ashbourne House smelled of hot tallow, damp wool, and the iron tang of pins warmed between her fingers. She had been in the house 9 days as a paid in-house dressmaker, 9 days since she had agreed to marry Mr. Pritchard in exchange for the cancellation of debts she had never signed, and every shelf around her testified to the terms: account books stacked with her mother's clipped annotations, bolts of silk for women who had never spoken her name, and one travelling bag beneath the table containing all she was still allowed to call her own. She did not pause. She turned the gown, set her needle, and began. The bell for the upper breakfast rang once, then twice, while the servants' hall below stairs filled with steam and clatter. Chloe took neither place. At Ashbourne House she occupied a precise category that spared everyone discomfort: blood relation in private ledgers, hired hands in public rooms, daughter only when a signature required it. By the time the third bell sounded, footsteps crossed the corridor outside her door, with the quick, synchronized rhythm of women dressing women. Someone laughed and said, "The seamstress girl is up before dawn again. She ought to be grateful for employment in a house this grand." The second voice answered, "She is to be married, is she not? That should settle her." Their steps continued. Chloe did not look up. She aligned the lace edge along the neckline and measured twice before she cut, because precision was the only form of refusal she could safely practice. A soft knock came without waiting for permission. Mrs. Miriam Dixon entered wearing dark morning silk and no expression at all, her gloves still on, as if the room itself might stain her fingers. Her eyes were grey and exact. They moved from the gown to Chloe's work table to the open ledger, counting, evaluating, assigning. She did not sit. "You will marry Mr. Pritchard in 14 days, Miriam said. "Gratitude is unnecessary." Chloe set the shears down before she answered. "As required, mother." "The papers have been amended. Your wage here is to continue until the ceremony, and your lodging will remain contingent on compliance." "I understand." Miriam turned one page of the ledger with the tip of her glove. "You will complete Lady Crowthorne's evening gown by tomorrow. You will alter your own dress without drawing notice. You will not speak of family matters to the staff." Chloe kept her hands flat on the table to hide the small tremor in her right thumb. "No, mother." Miriam's gaze lingered on the ivory fabric stretched between them. "Mr. Pritchard has been clear. He prefers modest presentation. Remove the beadwork." There had been no beadwork to begin with. Miriam knew that. The correction was not logistical. It was ritual, a small demonstration of who named reality in this house. Chloe inclined her head and took up the seam ripper. "As you wish," she said. Miriam gave a short nod, bored already, and moved toward the door. At the threshold she paused only long enough to add, "If you do this properly, the Dixon accounts will be settled by quarter's end. If you do not, there will be no further protection." Then she left without closing the door. The corridor sounds returned in fragments after she was gone. A maid hurrying with coal, a footman carrying polished boots, a soprano scale from someone practicing in an upstairs drawing room. Chloe threaded her needle again and pierced the lining where she had marked it. The stitch entered cleanly and disappeared. That was the skill they purchased from her hands, she thought. Not merely construction, but vanishing. Seams hidden so perfectly that no one considered the labour beneath the surface. She worked until the bell for noon, then carried a tray of mending downstairs to the long table near the scullery, where she was expected to eat quickly and alone. The stew had gone lukewarm by the time she sat. Across from her, two kitchen maids sorted beans and spoke in careful undertones that were not careful enough. "Mrs. Dixon says she has done a generous thing," one murmured. "Any other mother would have sent the girl away by now." The other replied, "Generous? She keeps the key to her room and the key to her wages in the same pocket." They looked up when Chloe raised her cup. Neither woman met her eye. Chloe drank water, thanked them for the bread, and returned to the workroom before either apology or pity could arrive. By the second week of her confinement at Ashbourne, she could have crossed the back passages blindfolded. 3 narrow turns past the still room, 1 stair to the linen press, 2 doors to the attic chamber where discarded gowns waited to be stripped and remade. Afternoon light pooled against the high windows in dusty bands. She sorted garments by urgency and value, pinning cards to each bodice with dates in her careful hand. Lady Crowthorne required 22 pearl loops repaired. Miss Atwell's sleeve seam had split under dancing strain. Mrs. Halford wanted a maternity panel concealed in pleating so that no one would discuss what was already visible. Every request arrived framed as confidence and command. Every finished piece returned upstairs with no name attached. Near 4 o'clock, Miriam summoned her again, this time to the little blue sitting room overlooking the south lawn. The room had once belonged to Chloe's grandmother. Now it held only account cases, locked drawers and a writing desk, positioned to face the door. Miriam stood beside it with 2 folded documents and a silver pen. "These are the revised dowry acknowledgements," she said. "Sign where marked." Chloe read them first. Miriam disliked delays, but she tolerated this one because reading resembled obedience when done in silence. The first page listed debts tied to Daniel Dixon's failed shipping venture, with penalties accrued over 6 years. The second named Mr. Edmund Pritchard as creditor and future husband, with obligations remitted upon marriage and all relevant claims transferred to him in trust. Chloe felt the old pressure gather at the base of her throat, the sensation she had learned to translate into steadiness before speaking. "The figure on line 7 is higher than last month's statement," she said. Miriam's mouth barely moved. "Interest. The warehouse fire was insured." "Not adequately." Chloe looked at the signature line. "And my wages after marriage?" "Discretionary." Discretionary meant revocable at will. She lifted the pen anyway. The nib scratched once, twice, then caught at the tail of her surname as if reluctant to complete the shape. Miriam blotted the ink, sanded it, and slid the papers into a leather folio without comment. "You will attend tea with Mrs. Pritchard tomorrow," she said. "She is not interested in your opinions. Wear something plain." "Yes, mother." Miriam studied her for a moment longer, searching perhaps for tears, argument, collapse, any display that might confirm the hierarchy she maintained so efficiently. Chloe offered none. She rose, curtsied, and walked from the room with measured steps that did not quicken until she reached the back stair. Evening settled by increments over Ashbourne House, gilding the banisters and then withdrawing from them, until the corridors were lit only by sconces and servant lamps. Chloe returned to her work table and drew the wedding gown close again. The fabric at the hem was older than the bodice, reused from an heirloom bridal dress kept in a cedar chest, and brought down for economy disguised as sentiment. She had been told to shorten it by 2 inches and reinforce the fall with tape. Instead, she turned it inside out and examined the underwork, tracing the dense hand-sewn edge with the pad of her finger. Most of the stitches were regular, worn faint by decades. One narrow section near the left back panel was different. Smaller bites, tighter tension. Thread a shade darker than the surrounding silk. Almost indistinguishable unless one had spent her life looking for the place where one hand ended and another began. A false seam, she thought. Deliberate. The hallway clock struck 8. Somewhere above her, laughter rose and fell around a card table. In the yard beyond the window, men crossed toward the stables carrying lanterns, their voices flattened by glass into low vibration. Chloe set the gown down, reached for the smallest scissors, and rested the tips against that altered line. If the seam concealed nothing, she could close it before dawn and no one would know she had looked. If it concealed something, then someone long before her had expected a woman with patient hands to find it. She took one breath and cut the first stitch. The silk parted with a dry whisper, and the hem loosened beneath her fingers, as if it had been waiting for that precise pressure for years. Chloe slid the scissor tips forward one stitch at a time, careful not to break the fabric grain, careful not to leave any evidence of haste, until a narrow channel opened and exposed something that was not silk at all, but a tightly rolled ribbon wrapped in waxed thread. It lay hidden in the dress, like a bone in a sleeve. She lifted it free, feeling the faint drag of age where the wax had adhered to the lining, and held it over the lamp. The thread around it was not household stock. It was fine legal blue, the colour used to tie packets in solicitors' offices, the colour no seamstress would waste on underwork no one would see. A board creaked in the corridor. Chloe blew the lamp lower, slipped the ribbon into the inside pocket of her apron, and turned the gown right side out in 2 swift motions. By the time a maid passed the open door with folded sheets, Chloe was bent over the wedding bodice again, needle moving in a plain running stitch that looked exactly like obedience. Her heart did not race. It struck hard and regular against her ribs, each beat a counted thing. She waited until footsteps faded, then lifted the gown hem once more and examined the opened section. Whoever had hidden the ribbon had resealed the channel from both ends, then run a decoy line over the top to mimic wear. Not panic work, planned work. Work done by someone who expected inspection and meant to survive it. A knock sounded, quick and light. Chloe dropped the hem at once, palmed the pins, and reached for her needle. Enter. The door opened on the housemaid Anne with a dented brass tray and a jug sweating from the pump. "For your room, miss," Anne said, from the yard. "I did not request it. He said to bring it anyway." "Who?" Anne shifted the tray from one wrist to the other. "Mr. Reed." Chloe looked past the maid's shoulder. A man stood at the far end of the corridor, where shadow from the stair bent around the wall. Plain coat, dark trousers, no hat. He was known among the servants as one of the groundsmen recently hired after winter storms split 2 cedar limbs and damaged the east wall roses. She had seen him at a distance carrying tools no one ever saw him use. He stood now with his hands empty, weight balanced as if waiting for a command neither given nor expected. When he stepped closer, she noticed his boots were clean enough for polished stone, and his cuffs bore no green stain from clipping. Anne set the tray on the table and departed without curiosity, door closing softly behind her. "Miss Dixon," he said. His voice was low, controlled, without the deferential rise most servants used with someone tied, however awkwardly, to the family. Up close, his eyes were dark grey, not flat but watchful, the expression of a man who catalogued details for later use. "Mr. Reed," Chloe replied. He glanced at her right hand. The skin along her forefinger was split from the day's pressing, a thin red line crossing the old callus. "The pump water is clean. Better than basin water for that." She did not move toward the jug. "You are kind. Only practical." He held her gaze for a fraction too long to be casual, then let it go. surveying the room in a quick arc that took in the stacked gowns, the locked pattern chest, the wedding bodice on its stand, and finally, the hem she had opened and reclosed with temporary pins. He stepped to the table, lifted the edge of the gown with permission implied rather than asked, and inspected the altered section once. "That stitch was not made by a servant," he said. The sentence entered the room and changed its dimensions. Chloe felt it physically, like a door unlatched somewhere she had believed was bricked over. She set her needle down with great care. "You speak with confidence about sewing, Mr. Reed." "I speak with confidence about concealment." There was no challenge in his tone, no demand, merely fact offered at measured distance. He released the fabric and straightened, and in that small movement there was discipline so complete it read as restraint. Labourers shifted, scratched, leaned. He did none of it. From the front of the house came the muffled roll of carriage wheels over gravel. Mr. Pritchard arriving early, perhaps, or another caller who would occupy Miriam and rearrange every task before supper. Chloe reached for the jug and poured water into a chipped cup, buying a second to think. "What do you want?" she asked. "To prevent a mistake." "Whose?" His mouth moved, almost a smile gone before it settled. "Yours, if you trust the wrong fire." She understood then that he had seen more than the seam. He had read the singe marks in the grate where she burned thread ends, the way she kept one candle separate from the others for close work, the way her sleeve brushed her apron pocket when she turned. Observation layered on observation. Not accident, not idle concern. Chloe set the cup down untouched. "You presume much for a groundsman." His answer came at once. "I presume your mother checks your bins." Silence stretched between them, taut and deliberate. In the corridor, a footman hurried past with silver and did not look inside. The house carried on around the workroom as if nothing had altered. Bells, doors, distant laughter from the morning room. Inside, nothing was as it had been an hour earlier. "What is your advice, then?" she said. "Do not keep it where she can search," he said. "Do not destroy it, and do not speak of it to anyone who reports to her." Anyone. Not the maids, not the housekeeper, not the solicitor who bowed to Miriam and accepted her figures as if numbers could not be coached. Chloe studied him with the same scrutiny he had turned on her. There was a faint white line at his left wrist, old scar tissue cut clean, the kind made by fencing wire or a uniform cuff edge rubbed for years. His hands were steady, nails trimmed close, no fresh soil beneath them. "You speak as if you know this house better than its owner," she said. He met that without flinching. "I know what houses conceal." A second carriage wheel crunch sounded outside, closer now. Voices rose in the front hall. "Mr." Reed stepped back from the table, returning distance to the room. "Drink the water," he said. "It will keep the cuts from worsening." He inclined his head, not quite servant, not equal, something else not yet named, and moved to the door. At the threshold he paused. "If you need to pass a packet unseen," he said, "the tool chest by the south glasshouse is never inventoried." Then he was gone, closing the door behind him with quiet precision, leaving the scent of cold air and iron keys that were not on his belt. At 8:30, Mrs. Pembroke from the household office sent for the repaired pearl loops. Chloe carried the dress upstairs by the service stair, eyes lowered as she crossed the side hall where family portraits watched from carved frames. Daniel Dixon's likeness hung there in naval blue, one hand at his waistcoat, gaze aimed past the painter at some private horizon. The servants dusted the frame but never lingered. Miriam disliked sentiment. Chloe slowed only long enough to notice that the gilt at the lower edge had been recently polished, brighter than the rest, as if someone had touched only that corner and then stopped. She moved on before anyone could interpret the pause as attachment. In Lady Crowthorne's dressing room, the air smelled of violet powder and hot irons. Two women stood half-laced before mirrors while a girl no older than 16 sorted ribbons by width. Lady Crowthorne accepted her repaired gown without looking at her face. "Set it there," she said, indicating a chaise with a fan. "And tell your mother that this sleeve must be narrowed. I refuse to appear provincial." "Yes, my lady." "You are the one to marry that creditor, are you not?" Chloe kept the garment level in her arms. "Yes, my lady." Lady Crowthorne examined her own reflection, pinched at her waist, and smiled at herself. Practical, then. Chloe inclined her head and withdrew. She had long since learned that cruelty delivered with indifference left fewer visible marks but travelled farther. In the passage outside, she recorded the sleeve alteration in her notebook with a pencil stub worn nearly to the ferrule, then went down to the still room for starch, up again for muslin, down again for tea trays to clear her own work table of someone else's cups. The house moved by bells and rank. Her day moved by whatever others dropped in her path. By the following morning, she had mended 3 hems, reset 2 boning channels, and eaten 1 crust, standing beside the linen press, while steam from the laundry dampened the back of her neck. The ribbon remained in her apron pocket all night, too dangerous for her room, too dangerous for the work table drawer where keys were checked, too dangerous anywhere except against her own skin. Each time she bent, she felt its light weight tap her hip, not heavy enough to drag, heavy enough to remind. At breakfast below stairs, the kitchen maid set down porridge and did not sit. "Mrs. Dixon asks whether the Pritchard veil is shortened," the maid said. "It will be finished by noon." "She asks whether you have thanked her for the gloves." Chloe stirred the porridge once and left the spoon untouched. "Please tell Mrs. Dixon I received them." The maid hesitated. "Yes, Miss Dixon." The title sounded accidental, like a dropped dish quickly caught. Chloe carried her bowl to the scullery and washed it herself. At 10, Miriam entered the workroom without knocking, keys at her wrist, a folded memorandum held between 2 fingers as though it might smear. "Mrs. Pritchard has moved tea to Thursday," she said. "You will alter the reception gown instead. Mr. Pritchard's sister requests less lace. She says lace suggests pretension." "The gown has no lace, Mother." "Then remove what she imagines." Chloe met her eyes for one breath. Miriam's were pale, untroubled, the eyes of someone who had practiced not seeing consequences until the habit became character. "I will adjust it," Chloe said. Miriam set the memorandum on the table and glanced at the basket of mending. "Why is this still here?" "It arrived at dawn." "Then dawn was too late. You are paid to anticipate." She turned toward the door, paused, and added, "Mr. Pritchard will call this evening to review accounts. Keep yourself out of the front rooms. We do not require theatrics." Chloe's fingers closed around the edge of the table until her knuckles whitened. "As you wish." Miriam left. The keys at her wrist chimed once against the latch. Near midday, when the sun reached the high window and laid a sharp rectangle of light across the cutting board, Chloe barred the workroom door under the pretense of pressing seams and drew out the hidden ribbon at last. The waxed thread around it had dried brittle. She eased it apart with a bodkin and unrolled the strip over clean linen to protect the ink. Names appeared first, written in narrow formal hand. Daniel Dixon. Eleanor Harrow Dixon. Witness before H. Markham, solicitor. A date from 19 years earlier. Then a sentence crossed with 2 revisions and 1 decisive final line stitched directly through the cloth, in tiny backstitch letters meant to survive damp and fire. Both. In the event of dispute, inheritance and trust. Principal transfer to the first daughter of Daniel Dixon upon proof of identity and majority. No appointed guardian may alienate funds for private debt. Chloe read it once. Then again, slower, each word striking a place inside her she had kept uninhabited for years, because hope in Ashbourne House functioned like contraband. Not merely a memory of fairness, a legal instrument, sewn, hidden, preserved in an heirloom that had passed through women's hands, while men signed ledgers upstairs. What Miriam had called generosity was management. What she had called protection was confinement with receipts. What Miriam had called generosity was management. What she had called protection was confinement with receipts. Chloe kept the ribbon spread across the linen and forced herself to read each line once more, this time tracing the stitched letters with the blunt end of her bodkin, so that the words entered her through touch as well as sight. First daughter of Daniel Dixon. No appointed guardian may alienate funds for private debt. The room seemed both smaller and sharper, every object suddenly implicated. The ledger weights, the pincushion patched in 3 places, the keyring hook beside the door, where only Miriam's keys ever hung. She rolled the strip again, tighter than before, and slid it into the inner seam she had opened in her apron waistband, then resewed the seam with thread, drawn from the same spool as the hem she had just repaired. By the time she bit the final knot free, her breathing had steadied. She folded the memorandum Miriam had left, adjusted the reception gown on its stand, and lifted the iron. A quiet rap sounded against the frame before she could answer. The door opened a hand's width, and Mr. Reed stepped in, carrying a lamp chimney wrapped in brown paper. "The hall lamp outside your room was smoking," he said. "Mrs. Pembroke asked that I exchange the glass." He did not look directly at her work table. He looked first at the ceiling vent, then at the wall bracket, as if he had come for nothing except the lamp. Chloe set down the iron and moved aside. "You may proceed." He crossed the room with that same controlled economy, no wasted motion, no scraping boot heels, and climbed the short stool by the door without asking for assistance. His sleeve lifted as he reached, and she saw again the pale scar near his wrist, older than his employment here could explain. He removed the soot-fogged chimney, replaced it with a clean one, trimmed the wick to exact height, and relit the flame in one attempt. "Better draft now," he said, testing it with his hand. "It will burn clear. You do many things for a man hired to prune roses." A brief pause. "I was hired to maintain the grounds." "The corridor is not a ground." "No," he said, stepping down. "But darkness spreads." It was the nearest he had come to speaking in metaphor, and because the sentence sounded unlike the rest of him, Chloe looked up. His eyes were steady, dark at the rim and lighter toward the center. The sort of eyes that took account before offering trust. He held her gaze only a moment, then noticed the open skin on her forefinger where the iron's handle had rubbed. "You have reopened that cut. It is of no consequence. It is where infection begins." He reached into his coat and set a small, folded square of clean linen on the table beside her thimble. No flourish, no explanation. The cloth smelled faintly of vinegar and lavender, common enough for wound washing, yet laundered far better than any rag from the servant's press. "Wrap it before supper," he said. Chloe let the silence sit between them. Kindness in Ashbourne House usually arrived with witness or leverage. This had arrived without either. "Thank you, Mr. Reed." He inclined his head. "Miss Dixon." When he turned to leave, his shoulder brushed the edge of the pattern shelf, and one brass thimble rolled off and struck the floor. He caught it before it spun under the cabinet and set it upright near her hand, careful not to touch her fingers. The gesture was so ordinary it should have passed unnoticed. It did not. Something settled in her chest that had been taut for days, a precise loosening she did not name. He left as quietly as he had entered, and the lamp burned without smoke. That evening, Mr. Pritchard arrived 2 quarters before the dinner bell, his carriage wheels rattling over gravel with the authority of a creditor come to inspect his collateral. Chloe heard his voice from the front saloon while she basted sleeve heads in the workroom, each phrase clipped and self-satisfied, numbers sharpened into threat by tone alone. She did not go near the front rooms. She finished the reception gown, pressed the skirt panels, and sent the dress upstairs through Anne with a note pinned to the cuff. Seams reinforced. No lace present to remove. Near midnight, she unpicked 2 stitches in her apron seam, checked that the hidden ribbon remained dry, and stitched it closed again in the dark. By Thursday morning, the house had settled into the peculiar hush that preceded social performance. Servants moving faster while speaking less, silver polished to mirror brightness, flowers repositioned twice for guests who would barely see them. Chloe carried a repaired pelisse to the side entrance just after dawn and found Mr. Reed at the church path gate with a coil of rope over one shoulder and no mud on his boots despite the wet grass. St. James's bell marked the quarter hour from beyond the trees. He stepped back to let her pass first, a formality no labourer bothered with below stairs. "You are out early, Miss Dixon," he said. "Lady Crowthorne tears sleeves as readily as paper. The repair could not wait." His mouth moved as if at a thought he did not release. "You sleep little. Work does not shorten itself." He glanced toward the drive where 2 footmen were unloading crates. Both men straightened when they saw him, not with comradeship, but with reflex. One of them gave the smallest nod, closer to acknowledgement than greeting. "Mr." Reed returned it almost imperceptibly and shifted his rope to the other shoulder. "You should take broth at noon," he said, "not tea." "Why broth? Tea and worry are poor companions." She almost answered with a sharper line and chose instead to keep her tone even. "I was not aware groundsmen were trained in dietary counsel. Some houses teach many disciplines." He stepped aside again and she passed through the gate. When she glanced back from the path curve, he had not moved. He stood watching the servants carry crates toward the rear kitchens, counting under his breath. She walked on before he could see that she had looked. 3 days passed before the next moment found them alone, and by then the pattern had become difficult to dismiss. He appeared where strained hinges failed, where lamps smoked, where corridor draughts threatened silk left to air. He never lingered. He always addressed her properly. He asked no question that required her to betray herself. On Sunday, after service, Chloe paused on the church steps with her mending satchel and felt the cold stones soak through thin soles, while parish families sorted themselves into rank and carriage order. She had just turned toward the lane when Mrs. Pritchard and her daughter intercepted her, both wrapped in plum wool and practised disapproval. "Miss Dixon," Mrs. Pritchard said, studying Chloe's plain cloak with open calculation. "You will keep your head lowered at our table on Thursday. My son values discretion." "Yes, madam." The daughter, Miss Lydia, smiled without warmth. "And avoid speaking of fabrics unless asked. Trade knowledge can be fatiguing." Chloe adjusted the satchel strap on her wrist. "As you prefer." A shadow crossed the lower step. Mr. Reed had come from the side aisle carrying a bucket of ash for the sexton, coat collar turned against the wind. He stopped at a respectful distance, yet the interruption was enough. Mrs. Pritchard drew her gloves tight, displeased to continue instruction before staff, and moved away with her daughter in tow. Mr. Reed set the bucket down. "Are you well?" "Yes." "That was not my question." Chloe met his eyes. "It is still my answer." A beat passed, then he gave one short nod, accepting the boundary without retreating from concern. Very good. He picked up the bucket and descended the steps. At the bottom, he paused and spoke without turning. The side lane is less crowded today. Practical advice, nothing more. Yet she took the side lane, and no one stopped her again. By the second week of October, she had begun to measure days by the places he appeared and the places he did not. In the conservatory, he was often present before breakfast, supposedly to clear storm-broken branches, though the glass panes were already repaired and the gravel paths immaculate. He examined drainage grates with the concentration of a surveyor, not a gardener. Once, as Chloe crossed with a basket of trimmings for table arrangements, she saw him crouched near a cracked flagstone beside the fountain, fingertips on the seam between stones, as if reading wear patterns. He rose when he sensed her and moved the basket from her hands to the bench without asking. You should not carry that with an injured hand. It is petals and stems, not cannon shot. Weight is weight. His answer was so flat that she almost laughed, and the sound escaped as a brief breath rather than a true laugh. He looked at her then, properly looked, and for the first time she saw the transformation the house had never been granted. He smiled. It changed his face from controlled severity to something unexpectedly younger, almost gentle, as if light had reached a room long shuttered. The smile was gone an instant later. Mrs. Pembroke is seeking you, he said. Blue sitting room. Miriam then. Orders, inventories, corrections framed as duty. Chloe straightened her gloves. You have a talent for unfortunate timing, Mr. Reed. I am told it is one of my faults. She took the basket and started towards the inner door. Only one? Today, he said, and turned back to the drainage grate before she could answer. Late that same night, she was called to the west drawing room for an emergency fitting after Miss Lydia Pritchard split a seam while practicing a curtsy she considered beneath her. The room glittered with too many candles, mirrors multiplying every movement into spectacle. Chloe knelt at the hem, pins between her lips, while Miss Lydia complained to her reflection, and two companions traded observations loud enough to wound. Mother says, Mrs. Dixon is fortunate the girl can sew, one remarked. Fortunate, Miss Lydia repeated. Yes, one must make use of what one has. Chloe finished the pinning, stood, and said, Walk 3 steps, if you please. Miss Lydia complied grudgingly. The seam held. Across the room, in the narrow gap between drapery and door, Mr. Reed stood with a folded ladder, waiting for dismissal after trimming a chandelier wick. He did not look at the women speaking. He looked at Chloe's hands, then at the pincushion on the table. When she set down her shears and one pin slipped to the carpet, he crossed the room under pretense of lifting the ladder and set the pin back beside her cushion with a movement so unobtrusive no one but she noticed. A small correction. A refusal to let her work be diminished by carelessness, not her own. After the guests withdrew and the candles burned lower, Chloe carried the altered dress through the back passage toward her room. At the turn near the old nursery stairs, she found him waiting beside the service clock, arms folded, expression unreadable. Miss Dixon. Mr. Reed. He held out a narrow packet wrapped in plain paper. Needles, size 10. The storeroom has switched to poorer steel. She took the packet but did not open it. How would you know the quality of millinery needles? I listen. To whom? To the people everyone interrupts. The answer landed with the quiet force of truth, spoken by habit. Chloe looked down at the packet in her palm, then back at him. You notice a great deal. Yes. Why? His gaze did not move from hers. Because neglect is expensive. Footsteps sounded at the far stair, and both of them shifted apart as a maid hurried past with bed linens and no attention to spare. When the corridor cleared, Mr. Reed inclined his head in formal dismissal. "Good night, Miss Dixon." "Good night, Mr. Reed." She reached her workroom, set the packet beside the lamp, and unwrapped it. 12 needles lay nested in waxed paper, each point true, each eye cleanly bored. Not extravagant. Exact. She threaded one at once and returned to the reception gown, reinforcing the inner waist seam where strain would first reveal itself. Outside, Ashbourne House settled by layers into silence. Near 1 in the morning, while she knotted off the last stitch, the front door opened below with unexpected force, voices rising in the hall where no voices should have been at that hour. A man she did not recognize spoke Miriam's name in the hard, official cadence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and then another voice answered, lower and familiar, too distant to pass but unmistakably Mr. Reed's. Chloe stilled, needles suspended above silk, listening as the house drew breath around words she could not yet hear. The corridor lamp hissed once in its glass, and then the front hall below carried clearer sound. The heavy click of the main door set back on its bolt, Miriam's measured cadence, and a stranger answering in the legal monotone that turned people into entries. She set the gown aside, wiped her hands on a linen square, and moved to the workroom door. The boards beyond were cold through her thin soles. From the turn in the upper passage, she could see the hall below through the balustrade, lit by 2 wall sconces and 1 hand lamp held by a footman in shirt sleeves. Miriam stood at the black and white marble threshold in morning silk thrown over her nightdress, hair pinned but unadorned, as composed at 1 in the morning as she was at noon. Opposite her stood a narrow man in a travelling cloak, water darkening the hem. He held a dispatch case with blue ties. Mr. Reed stood half a step behind him, not as servant and not as guest. Coat plain, posture exact. "The papers were requested for tomorrow," the stranger said. "Mr. Halvan insists on inspecting original household settlements, not summaries." Miriam's expression did not alter. "At this hour. He departs for Bath by noon. He will not delay." A beat of silence passed. Then Mr. Reed spoke, voice low enough that Chloe had to lean to catch it. "The blue study fire has not been laid. If records are open tonight, candles will be safer in the morning room." Miriam turned her head toward him with a glance that carried habitual command and fleeting calculation both. "You are attentive, Mr. Reed." "I am employed to notice hazards." The stranger shifted his case from one hand to the other. "Madam, I require your acknowledgement." Miriam took the paper, signed on the hall table without reading, and returned it. "Very well, 9 o'clock." The man bowed and withdrew into the rain-thinned dark. The footman shut the door. Miriam remained where she was for 1 heartbeat longer, then looked up toward the upper landing as if she felt observation like heat. Chloe stepped back before that gaze could settle. By the time she regained her workroom and lifted her needle, the hall below had gone quiet, except for the retreating cadence of Mr. Reed's boots down the side passage. She did not sleep. She finished the reinforcement seam, pressed the gown skirt, and wrapped both hands around a cup of pump water gone warm before dawn. At 6:30, Ashbourne resumed its machinery, coal scuttles, bells, the first tray to the nursery floor. Chloe pinned her apron, checked the concealed ribbon at her waistband by touch alone, and began taking in the waist of Miss Lydia's morning dress, when Anne appeared in the doorway, breathless. "Mrs. Dixon asks for the heirloom veil and gown hem samples at once," Anne said. "She says Mr. Halvern will want every alteration accounted for." Chloe's fingers did not falter at the needle. "Tell Mrs. Dixon she shall have them in 20 minutes. Anne nodded and hurried off. 20 minutes was not enough to panic and still pass for obedient. Chloe shut the door, lifted the heirloom skirt from the shelf, and turned to the window where the light was strongest. The old concealed channel at the hem lay where she had reopened and restored it, nearly invisible unless one knew the exact panel. She checked the panel and found it empty as she had left it. Then she slipped her bodkin beneath the inner seam of her apron waistband, opened 3 tiny stitches, and slid out the legal ribbon, still dry, still tightly rolled. Her mouth tasted of iron. If Halvan was competent and Miriam cautious, the gown would be examined today. If the channel drew attention, any hint of concealed papers would turn the house inside out. If the ribbon was found on her under Miriam's eye, it would vanish before noon. A knock sounded twice, then once. Mr. Reed's rhythm. "Enter," she said. He stepped in carrying a wrapped bundle of account ledgers for the upper office, set them near the door, and waited for instructions she did not give. His gaze went to her hands, to the open hem panel lying flat and empty, to the narrow blue-tied roll in her palm. No surprise crossed his face, only focus. "Inspection?" he asked. 9 o'clock, original records." His eyes flicked to the corridor and back. "You have minutes." She opened the pattern chest, closed it again. Too obvious. She crossed to the grate, then stopped. Fire was what Miriam would search first. Mr. Reed watched the room the way he watched drainage lines and lamp draft, mapping routes, vulnerabilities, exits. His coat hung open where one button had loosened, and for the first time she noticed how worn the lining had become along the inner seam, hand-repaired once in darker thread. He had told her the tool chest by the south glasshouse was never inventoried, but reaching it now meant crossing 2 visible passages with a packet everyone in the house would notice, if they were told to notice. She looked at his coat again and saw the answer arrive as plain work. "Mr. Reed," she said, already reaching for her bodkin, "stand by the door." He did not ask why. He moved there at once, body shielding the corridor view. Chloe stepped close enough to smell rain wool and cold air, slipped the bodkin through a weak place in his inner lining, and opened 2 inches of seam with 3 swift cuts. Her fingers were steady now. She slid the rolled ribbon into the gap, pressed it flat against the interfacing, and stitched the lining shut with tiny blind catches, knots hidden under the facing. 12 seconds to start, 40 to finish. No trace from outside. When she looked up, his jaw had tightened once, not from discomfort, but from the gravity of trust transferred without speech. "You understand what this is," she said. "Yes. If they search me, it must not be found. It will not be. Do not remove it unless I ask." "I will not." She snipped the thread and smoothed the cloth where she had worked. Her hand brushed the scar at his wrist by accident. He did not move away. For one suspended moment they stood in the narrow room, among silk scraps and account slips like conspirators without a pact, joined by labour and risk rather than promise. A bell rang downstairs for morning tea. He stepped back first, restoring distance. "You still need something to burn," he said. Chloe nodded once. She crossed to her work table, cut a strip of discarded hem silk to matching width, wrapped it in old waxed thread from a notions jar, and rubbed soot along the edge to age it. Not perfect under a solicitor's lens. Good enough for a mother who wanted confirmation, not proof. Mr. Reed lifted the ledger bundle again. At the threshold, he paused. "If she asks who entered this room, say the lamp smoked. She will not believe me. She does not need to." He left by the side corridor, boots soundless on the runner. Chloe resealed the heirloom hem, folded the decoy strip into her palm, and carried veil, sample swatches, and composure to the blue study. Miriam received the tray of materials without thanks. Halvan had not yet arrived. Only the silver tea service and 3 open ledgers occupied the desk. The morning room shutters stood half open, letting in a pale shaft of light that made dust visible above the carpet. "You took too long," Miriam said. "I brought every requested piece." Miriam held out her hand. "What is in your left palm?" Chloe opened her fingers. The decoy strip lay there, narrow and grey with old wax. "I found this while shortening the heirloom hem," she said. "I assumed it was damaged packing thread." Miriam's eyes sharpened by a degree so slight another woman might have missed it. She took the strip between gloved fingers and turned it once, reading surface, age, nothing. "Where is the remainder?" "There was none." "Burn it." Chloe crossed to the grate and struck a taper from the candle. The thread caught slowly, then flared, curling into black at the edge before dropping as ash. She watched until no recognizable fiber remained. Behind her, she could feel Miriam's attention settle and, for the first time in days, ease. "Return to your room," Miriam said. "Do not linger near the study while Mr. Halvin is here." "As required, mother." She curtsied and withdrew, carrying the empty tray with both hands to hide the slight tremor that arrived only after the door shut behind her. By late afternoon, the solicitor had come and gone, and Ashbourne wore the brittle quiet of a household that had survived inspection without confessing relief. Chloe spent the intervening hours in work that demanded absolute precision, resetting tiny sleeve pleats on Mrs. Pritchard's visiting dress, turning a frayed cuff, hand-finishing button loops too narrow for machine pass. She saw Mr. Reed only once across the south lawn through rain-streaked glass, conferring with the stablemaster over inventory slates, as if numbers belonged to him. He did not look up. "At 6, Mrs." Pembroke sent word that tea was required in the blue study for Miriam and a second visitor. Chloe loaded the tray herself. Pot, 2 cups, lemon slices, sugar tongs, a plate of dry biscuits no one would touch. As she crossed the upper corridor, she heard the study door click nearly closed, not latched. Voices travelled through that inch of space with dangerous clarity. She should have announced herself. She stopped instead, tray balanced against her hip, because the second voice belonged to Halvin and carried the clipped urgency of men discussing liability. "I must advise caution," he said. "If any prior acknowledgement of Daniel Dixon's issue exists, your position is exposed." Miriam answered, bored as ever. "There is no such acknowledgement in any file that matters. Verbal reports from former staff suggest otherwise. Former staff suggest many things when dismissed." Halvin lowered his tone. "Then why insist on immediate marriage to Pritchard?" A porcelain spoon tapped once against a cup. Miriam's reply came flat, almost weary with the effort of explaining to someone slower than herself. "Because she is not a daughter. She is insurance. Once she is married, we petition to have her declared incompetent to hold trust principal. Her husband administers. We retain practical control." The tray edge bit into Chloe's palm. Heat rushed from her face to her hands so quickly she thought she might drop the pot and shatter every cup in the corridor. She did not move. Inside the room, paper rustled. Halvin said, "That petition will be contested." "By whom?" "She may object." Miriam gave a short laugh, no mirth in it at all. "She obeys. That is her sole reliable trait." Something in Chloe's grip changed from tremor to rigidity. She set the tray silently on the console table beside the door because her fingers had begun to lose sensation. A needle from her cuff case, tucked there after mending, pressed against her thumb pad. She bent to remove it and snapped it clean between finger and nail without a sound. Inside, Halvin spoke again, cautious now. "If she learns of this strategy—" "She will not," Miriam said. "She reads what I place before her. She signs where I mark. In 14 days, the matter closes." Chloe straightened, picked up the tray again, and stepped back from the door before either voice could detect breath on the other side. Her stomach had knotted so tightly she had to draw air in shallow measures to keep her posture even. The corridor carpet pattern swam once, then steadied. She crossed to the service stair, descended without haste, and delivered the tea through Anne with instructions that Mrs. Dixon required immediate service and no interruption. In the still room, she braced one hand against the stone sink until the cramp in her fingers eased. She did not cry. She turned on the pump, let cold water run over both wrists, and watched the current carry away a tiny crescent of blood where the broken needle had pierced skin. Above her, the house continued in its practiced rhythm, bells and steps and doors, while inside her something harder than pain set into place with the clean finality of a lock. Something harder than pain set into place with the clean finality of a lock, and Chloe carried that new hardness up the back stair as if it were a second spine. The corridor outside the workroom lay empty, the sconces burned low, and the wedding veil she had finished that morning waited on its stand, like a ghost invited too early. She closed the door, drew the bolt, and stood for one measured breath with both hands on the table until sensation returned to her fingers. Then she moved. She did not begin with keepsakes. She owned almost none. She opened the travelling bag beneath the cutting table and placed inside it what could be used without permission. 2 plain day dresses rolled tight, 1 wool shawl, stockings mended at heel and toe, her best shears wrapped in linen, bodkin, thimble, needle packet from Mr. Reed, a narrow ledger of her wages, and the small tin of salve for split skin. She added the legal copy of her birth entry she had paid a clerk to transcribe 3 years earlier, and hidden behind pattern tissue ever since. Last, she took the folded pair of wedding gloves Miriam had sent and set them on top for a moment, studying the kid leather seams she had reinforced herself. Then she removed them and left them on the table. They belonged to that bargain, not to her. When she unpinned the workroom key from her apron and laid it beside the gloves, the sound was soft as a dropped bead, and louder than any argument she had refused to give. She crossed to the dress form, lifted the veil, folded it into a strict rectangle, and placed it beneath the key as if returning borrowed property in proper order. No note, no explanation. She had been explained over for years. By the time the clock over the rear stairs struck 10, she had changed into her plain brown walking dress and heavier boots, braided her hair into a coil that would hold through rain or wind, and extinguished every lamp except one. The remaining flame she carried into the corridor, not hidden, not hurried. She moved down the service stair and into the lower hall where staff traffic thinned after supper, and at the junction near the still room, she met Anne, coming up with folded napkins. "Miss Dixon," Anne whispered, eyes widening at the bag in Chloe's hand. "Are you being sent out?" "I am going out." "At this hour?" "Yes." Anne glanced toward the front of the house. "Mrs. Dixon said no one was to unbolt the main door after 10. Chloe shifted the bag to her other hand. "Then she may tell me so herself." It was not defiance in tone. It was simple statement. Anne stared at her 1 second longer, then stepped aside without another word. The front hall lay almost dark, only one branch of candles lit beside the portrait wall. Daniel Dixon's painted gaze followed the marble line toward the door, and for once, Chloe did not lower her eyes when she passed beneath him. She set her lamp on the console, placed her hand on the brass handle, and had just turned it when Miriam's voice came from the blue study behind her, clipped and unmistakable. "Where do you imagine you are going?" Chloe turned. Miriam stood framed in the half-open study doorway, silk dressing gown belted over evening black, a sheaf of papers in one hand, and irritation arranged over her features like powder. She looked first at the bag, then at Chloe's boots, then at the door handle in Chloe's grasp. "You will return upstairs at once," Miriam said. "Mr. Pritchard calls tomorrow. There are fittings unfinished." Chloe answered without raising her voice. "I have completed every fitting requested." "That is not the point. It is the only point that has involved me." Miriam took one step into the hall. "You are overwrought. Put down that bag." Chloe did not move. The marble felt steady under her feet, cold through leather soles, real in a way the study had never been. "No, Mother." Miriam's mouth flattened. "You are not competent to make decisions about your own affairs." The sentence struck with the same tone as all the others, administratively cruel, and because Chloe had heard its legal echo through the study door an hour earlier, it landed not as shock, but confirmation. She rested her fingers more firmly around the handle. "You said that already," she replied. "To Mr. Halvan." For the first time in years, Miriam's composure shifted, only slightly, but enough. "You were listening." "I was carrying your tea." Miriam glanced toward the servants' passage as if calculating witnesses. "Then you misunderstood what was said." "I understood perfectly." "Do not be theatrical, Chloe. This arrangement is for your protection." Chloe held her gaze. "No." One word, quiet and exact. She turned the handle fully and opened the door. Night air entered the hall, cool and damp, touching candle flames into brief incline. Behind her, Miriam's voice sharpened. "If you step outside this house without my consent, do not expect to return." Chloe looked back once. "I did not ask." She walked out, closing the door with controlled force behind her, and the latch settled like a seal. The gravel drive gave under her boots as she crossed from the main steps toward the service path that led around the stables and down to the gardeners' cottages. No lantern burned in the lower yard. Stable lights had been trimmed, and only the coach house window held a stripe of amber where someone banked a stove. Her bag felt heavier with each turn, not from weight, but from consequence. She had left wages due, shelter guaranteed only by compliance, and whatever fraction of social standing remained to a woman walking unescorted through her mother's grounds at night. She kept moving. At the edge of the south glass house, she paused under the eave and listened. Wind moved through clipped yews. Somewhere a loose shutter tapped once, then stilled. From farther off came the muffled toll of St. James's half-hour. She drew one breath, adjusted her grip, and took the narrow path toward the last cottage, the one assigned to temporary ground staff. The small windows there were dark. She lifted her hand and knocked 3 times. No answer. She waited, hearing blood in her ears and the faint drip from a gutter chain. She knocked again, firmer. This time there was movement inside. One step, then another, then the slide of a bolt drawn with deliberate care. The door opened. Elias Reed stood in the threshold, but not as the house had known him. He wore formal black coat and waistcoat, linen at his throat crisp, boots polished, hair tied back in the older style seen in family portraits. In his left hand he held a candle. In his right, a small signet ring that caught the light and flashed the Harrow crest Chloe had dusted in gilt on frame corners all autumn. His expression did not dramatize the moment. It settled it. "Come in, Miss Dixon," he said. She crossed the threshold and he shut the door against the yard cold. The cottage room was plain but orderly. Table scrubbed white, 2 chairs, a trunk at the wall, maps rolled in a leather case, and on the table beside a folded coat lay a narrow blue-tied ribbon she recognized even before her breath caught. Her ribbon, the one sewn into his lining by her own hand. She set her bag down and remained standing. "You removed it," she said. "Only when I was certain you had left the house." He placed the signet beside the ribbon and met her eyes. "I am not Mr. Reed. I am Elias Harrow, and this codicil was sewn by my grandmother to protect your claim until I could prove the theft." The room did not tilt. It clarified. Footman straightening as he passed. Clean boots in wet grass. Knowledge of ledgers, lamps, searches, and hazard. The scar at his wrist where tailored cuffs had worn. The title no one used below stairs because he had hidden it so completely that they could not even suspect it. Chloe looked from his face to the ring and back again. "You watched me," she said. "Yes." "For how long?" "Since your arrival at Ashbourne House." She considered that and found, unexpectedly, that she was not offended by being seen. She was angry at everything that had made such watching necessary. "Why conceal yourself from me?" "Because your mother has informants in every rank of that house," he said. "If she had known I had entered as Harrow, the records would have vanished before we could secure them. If she had seen us speak freely, you would have been removed from the workroom within a day." He paused. "Concealment was the only way to keep evidence near you and suspicion away from you." She stepped closer to the table and touched the ribbon's edge with one finger. "And the codicil line. Authentic, witnessed, binding." "You are certain?" "I verified it with Halvan's predecessor and with my grandmother's correspondence. The trust language was drafted by Markham himself after Daniel Dixon amended his will." His voice remained measured, but a current of contained force ran beneath it now that the disguise was gone. Authority had not been added. It had been uncovered. Chloe looked at him fully then, at the face she had known in fragments and now saw assembled into its proper shape. "What did you intend to do if I obeyed and married Pritchard in 14 days?" "I had prepared injunction papers," he said, "but they would have come late, and your position would have been weaker once the marriage settled control." A brief, sharp exhale. I was running out of time. Silence held for 2 beats. Candlelight moved across the plain boards, across the scuffed toe of her boot, across the signet where the Harrow crest sat in miniature certainty. Outside, the wind shifted and eased. She drew off her gloves, revealing the crescent cut on her thumb where the needle had broken. Elias saw it at once and reached for the water jug on the side shelf, then stopped, waiting. Permission, even now. "You may," she said. He poured clean water into a basin and set it on the table beside the ribbon. No servant would have done it with such grave courtesy. No aristocrat had ever done it for her at all. She rinsed the cut, wrapped it in the linen square he had given her earlier, and tied the knot one-handed. "What happens next?" she asked. "Tonight you remain here," he said. "At first light we go to the steward's office, not the blue study. I have already sent notice to 2 independent witnesses and to a magistrate clerk. Your mother cannot bury this once it is entered." "You sent notice when?" "An hour ago, after I heard Halvan in the hall." So he had been there, close enough to hear what she heard, close enough to understand that the line had been crossed. Chloe sat at last, not from weakness, but because her knees had begun to tremble with delayed reaction, and she refused to fall standing. Elias moved the second chair nearer the hearth and set it where she could warm her hands without turning her back to the door. He did not sit until she had settled. By the time the cottage clock marked midnight, the facts between them had been laid out like pattern pieces. The codicil text, Daniel Dixon's acknowledgement date, the diverted trust disbursements Elias had traced through 3 banks and 1 shell account, the expected counterclaims Miriam might attempt, and the order in which documents must be presented so none could be dismissed as fabrication. Practical, sequential, precise. Yet beneath the legal architecture, another recognition moved, quieter and harder to deny. He had noticed what others dismissed. She had trusted what she could not yet name. Both had acted without guarantee. When the candle burned low, Elias rose and placed an extra blanket over the chair back nearest the hearth. "You may take the bed," he said. "I will keep the outer room." Chloe met his eyes, dark grey in the softened light, and saw there no performance, no claim upon the risk she had taken, only steady regard. "We will both keep the outer room," she said. "There is work to finish before dawn." His mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but close. "As you wish, Miss Dixon." She unrolled the codicil once more on the table between them, smoothed the stitched line flat with her palm, and began preparing the case that would carry her name back into the house that had tried to erase it. She worked beside him until the first light thinned the cottage window from black to pewter, copying names and dates in a clear clerk's hand while Elias sorted documents into 3 packets bound with separate tape. The original codicil ribbon went into oilskin. The account abstracts he had traced through shell ledgers went into a second wrap. Her wage book and birth entry transcript went into a third. When she finished, she threaded her mother's discarded wedding gloves through the handle of her travelling bag and left them there, unused as if to mark the life she was not returning to. At dawn, a knock sounded at the cottage door. 2 measured taps, then 1. Elias opened to Mr. Halvern, damp at the shoulders, face drawn from a sleepless night, and the uneasy knowledge that caution had arrived too late. Behind him stood the magistrate clerk in plain brown, quill case at his belt, and Reverend Cole from St. James's, with his spectacles already fogged. The second independent witness was Mrs. Pembroke, summoned from the household office, still wearing her keys at her wrist. Halvern removed his gloves and addressed Chloe first, not Elias. "Miss Dixon, I must ask directly. Are you here by your own choice?" "I am," she said. "Have you been coerced by any party present?" "No." The clerk dipped his pen and wrote. Elias watched in silence until the statement was complete, then handed over the first packet. "Record that the claimant presents an original sewn codicil with witness line and date. Record chain of custody from heirloom garment to present." They walked to Ashbourne House together, not by the service path but through the front drive, where morning mist still lay low along the gravel, and the great hall doors had only just been opened by footmen. The same men who had straightened whenever Mr. Reed passed, now bowed without confusion. "Lord Harrow," the elder footman said, voice tight with formal relief. "The hall is prepared." Chloe heard the title land in the space where groundsman had once sat, and felt the old pattern crack cleanly. Not disguise, strategy, not chance kindness, deliberate protection. The hearing took place in the great hall under Daniel Dixon's portrait, where she had carried trays and lowered her gaze for years. Today, a long oak table had been set beneath the windows, with 6 chairs, ink, sand, and seal wax. The chandeliers were unlit. Morning did the work instead, pale and merciless across marble and paper alike. Miriam arrived from the blue corridor in dark silk and gloves, with the composure of a woman accustomed to controlling rooms by entering them. That composure altered only when she saw Elias at the head of the table in formal black. She stopped. "Mr. Reed." Elias did not rise. "No, Mrs. Dixon." Halvern cleared his throat. "Madam, this is a preliminary estate review with magistrate notation. You were informed records would be tested for authenticity." Miriam's gaze moved from one face to the next, measuring allegiance, then settled on Chloe. "You have made a grave error." Chloe took her seat beside the clerk and folded her hands on the table. "Proceed." The first document was the codicil ribbon. Elias unwrapped the oilskin and laid the narrow strip on linen so the stitched line and signatures could be examined without handling strain. The clerk read aloud each name, each date, each witness mark. Reverend Cole confirmed the parish registry entry for Daniel Dixon's lawful acknowledgement. Mrs. Pembroke identified Eleanor Harrow Dixon's notation style from old household inventories she had maintained before Miriam took direct control. Halvan compared the signature on the codicil to a will abstract from his predecessor's archive. The hand matches, the witness line matches, the legal phrasing is Markham's. Miriam's voice remained flat. A forged ribbon proves only that someone can sew. Chloe opened her own packet and slid forward her wage ledger, pages worn from nightly balancing by candlelight. Then we test numbers. For 2 hours the hall held nothing but page turns, quill scratches, and the occasional clink of the clerk's seal spoon against inkstone. Elias produced transfer records from 3 banks and 1 shell account linked to debt servicing that never touched legitimate trust obligations. The mysterious cracked flagstone by the conservatory fountain was accounted for when he placed on the table a narrow tin tube recovered from beneath it at dawn, containing copied quarterly balances he had hidden there after each verification in case the blue study burned. The tool chest by the south glasshouse, never inventoried, yielded duplicate key logs and receipt stubs showing late-night access to locked ledgers on dates Miriam had declared no review occurred. When Halvan reached the pages bearing Chloe's wages, he grew still. These payments were entered as disbursements to beneficiary, then reclaimed the same week as household debt offsets. Chloe met his eyes. My own labour was used to prove my dependence. The clerk wrote that line verbatim. Miriam removed one glove finger by finger, buying time. You have no proof those offsets were unauthorized. Elias slid across a final folio, Daniel Dixon's trust terms, certified copy, with the codicil language mirrored. No appointed guardian may alienate funds for private debt. Silence followed. Even the footman by the doors did not shift. Miriam turned toward Halvan with bored disdain sharpened at the edge. You advised those structures. Halvan did not look up. I advised caution. You chose concealment. The magistrate clerk sanded the page and read the interim ruling in a voice that did not rise. Chloe Dixon was recognized as lawful beneficiary and competent adult claimant. All private guardianship assertions were suspended. Estate and trust control were to be transferred immediately, pending full chancery confirmation. Mrs. Miriam Dixon was removed from financial authority and residential command at Ashbourne House, effective at once. Miriam's jaw tightened once. She faced Chloe. You think this is victory. It is merely administration. Chloe stood. Her hands did not tremble. Then let it be administered. 4 words. Nothing wasted. Mrs. Pembroke stepped forward with 2 housemaids and accepted Miriam's key ring without struggle. The keys chimed against her palm, the same sound that had marked orders and lockouts for years, now emptied of force. Miriam left by the side passage with 1 valise and no audience. No one called after her. By early afternoon, the same hall that had reduced Chloe to utility became the place where staff lined quietly to receive new instructions. Elias, now openly Lord Harrow, spoke in short, measured sentences. Wages would be regularized by written contract. Household and estate accounts would be audited by an outside office. No servant would be penalized for prior compliance under disputed authority. Then he turned to Chloe before everyone and asked, Miss Dixon, will you assume control of the West workrooms under your own books? Every face in the hall shifted toward her. Lady Crowthorne's seamstress girl, Miss Lydia's trade knowledge. Practical, then. Chloe answered, yes. No speech followed. She simply took the key Mrs. Pembroke offered, crossed the marble she had once crossed carrying trays, and unlocked the abandoned dressmaking rooms herself. Dust rose when the door opened, carrying cedar, old starch, and the faint metallic scent of unused shears. Sunlight caught on disused forms and long tables scarred by decades of cutting. She set down her bag, opened both windows, and tied back the curtains. Anne appeared in the doorway with a bucket and brushes, uncertain. "Miss Dixon," she said softly, then corrected herself. "Mrs. Dixon, if I may remain in your rooms, I will work properly." Chloe handed her the first cloth. "You will remain. Start with the presses." By late day, the rooms had shifted from mausoleum to workshop. The wedding veil she had folded and left was retrieved from her old table and placed in the linen chest for repurposing. The unused gloves were cut into reinforcement patches for fitting stands. The needle packet Elias had given her was opened and distributed. 2 to Anne, 2 to a junior seamstress from town, the rest kept in the central tray. Nothing stayed symbolic. Everything went back to use. When evening settled, the house quieted around new routines. Halvan sent written acknowledgement that the magistrate filing had been entered and that Miriam's petition draft to declare incompetence was voided without hearing. Reverend Cole delivered the parish extract copy with official seal. Mrs. Pembroke reported that the loaded paws and knowing looks among senior footmen were now plain. 3 had served the Harrow family before Miriam's tenure and had recognized Elias weeks earlier, holding silence under his instruction. 1 admitted the polished corner on Daniel Dixon's portrait had been his own doing each morning, a private sign of loyalty to the name he was not permitted to speak. After supper, Chloe remained alone in the reopened workroom, chalking a new client pattern across brown paper, while firelight warmed the brick hearth behind her. She heard Elias's step in the corridor before the knock, still measured, still unmistakable. "Enter," she said. He came in without ceremony, coat unbuttoned, title set aside in the way he stood rather than announced. For a moment he simply looked at the room. Windows open, tables occupied, account book labelled Dixon, dressmaking rooms in her hand. "You restored it in one day," he said. "It was waiting to be used." He walked to the table and set down a folded document. "Partnership deed, business only. Your name first." She scanned the page. Terms were clear, balanced, and explicit about independent control. Profit shares, liability boundaries, staffing authority. No hidden clauses. No discretionary revocation. She signed and sanded the line. When she looked up, he was watching her with the same steady attention he had given seams, lamps, and danger, but now without concealment. "There is a second question," he said. "Not for ledgers." She waited. "I would ask for partnership in life as well," he said. "No compulsion, no bargain. Equal terms, or none." The room held stillness, then warmth, then the quiet recognition that had been building in corridors and church steps and work tables long before either had named it. Chloe set down the pen, met his eyes, and felt the answer settle with the same clean finality as the lock that had turned inside her the night she left. "Yes, my lord," she said, "on equal terms." He smiled, and the transformation was no less striking for being expected now. From guarded discipline to open relief, almost wonder. He did not reach for her until she offered her hand. When she did, he took it gently, careful of the healing cut at her thumb, as if even joy required precision. Later, after he had gone to instruct the steward and she had banked the fire, Chloe stood alone for one last moment in the doorway of the workroom. Below, Ashbourne moved through evening under a different order. Above her desk lay the codicil, now copied, sealed, and archived. Her wage ledger now closed as evidence and reopened as record. Her old workroom key retired to a drawer, and beside them, the new key to rooms that answered to her name. She turned down the lamp and closed the door behind her, not as someone dismissed, but as someone who belonged.